Everybody to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library, which is a project of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library. And my name is Gene Rule. I call myself the General Secretary of the party since I do the mailings and make the coffee. So, but I want to welcome everybody and let you know a little bit about the library since not all of you are regulars here. We were founded about 10 or 12, maybe 15 years ago as the research and educational arm of the library to carry out the functions of these functions for the mission of the library, which is to keep the works of Karl Marx alive and well and relate them to the ongoing struggles. What we are is an independent group of students, scholars, activists, who share an interest in Karl Marx. Some of us are members of disciplined parties, some of us are members of undisciplined parties, and some of us are simply interested in Marx. So we have different perspectives, and our programs don't represent any kind of group consensus on the issues involved, although we all love Grover. But I can say that since we're among friends. Not everybody loves Grover.
He's a Stalinist.
That's right.
So, at any rate, so these don't represent a group consensus, but we feel it's very important that we study Marx in a scientific way, looking at him from every angle possible. So that's why we have diverse points of view represented here. But again, we've been going on for some 15 years, not quite as strongly as now, but so that's a little bit about the background. We're very fortunate in having Grover Furr, and not only having Grover Furr, but Raj Sahai here to introduce Grover Furr. And just a quick word, normally Grover will talk for about an hour, more or less. We're asking people to hold their questions until the end. We'll take a break, do a fund appeal, and then go to Q&A. It's yours.
So I don't really, in this room, I don't really need to introduce Grover Furr, who you know him. His books are here. I've known him for the last 8 years, and every one of his books he has written, I start reading, and I don't leave it until I'm finished. So, but I will have to say a few words. Capitalism is in crisis and has created disaster for world's vast majority, as you know. Climate change affects our lives. Half the U.S. workers can't live with what they earn. Socialism is once again where youth is looking for solution. But socialism promised by bourgeois politicians is simply a mirage. But workers and masses here are afraid of real socialism because it has been so long and so deeply maligned, of which the symbol became Joseph Stalin. Steven Kotkin of Princeton has spent the last 30 years of his life studying Stalin, period of Soviet history. And, I'm sorry, this is not a microphone. So Steven Kotkin of Princeton University has spent the last 30 years, Princeton is alma mater of Grover Furr, those who you don't know this. And he's basically spent his life doing that, and he's writing in 3 volumes what he calls a definitive biography of Stalin, 2 of which have been published. So his second volume was on titled Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, and this covers the Soviet history from 1929 to 41. When I read it, I was quite angry, and I wrote a review in ML Today. But Grover said to me at that time, he said, wait, I'm going to write a book on that. And so Grover Furr's new book is titled Stalin, Waiting for the Truth, appropriately, and he examines Kotkin's works. So I give you Grover Furr.
Thank you.
Welcome, Grover.
Thanks very much. And this is where I should stand, Mehmet? This is a good place to stand?
I'll follow you.
Oh, okay. I don't know about this camera. Nobody's following. I think it's probably where it should be. It's okay? Okay, good.
But those are the microphones that...
Okay, very good. Okay, so just to let you know, we have copies of the new book, which looks like this. The design is meant to resemble, but not completely imitate, the design of the cover of Kotkin's book, on which it is a critique. I also have other books here on Kotkin and other books that I will refer to in the course of my talk. So they're here, and we'll do the book sales and so forth afterwards. They're at a special price, of course, for you who are attending here at the Niebel Proctor. I'm always very glad to come here, and I thank Jean and Raj and Bonnie in the back and Mehmet for doing this, and all of those of you who've made this event and similar events possible. One thing is that I'm not going to talk for an hour. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, I think it is. Not too many people can really pay close attention for an hour. I try never to let my talks go more than about 35 minutes, so as not to put everybody completely asleep. And then we can do the Q&A, and I hope we'll have a lively discussion. So, let me start, as I start all my classes. I teach medieval literature and other literatures at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and I start all my classes by asking everybody, all the students and myself, to put your cell phones on airplane mode, or alternatively, you can put them silent or make them so that they'll just vibrate. Just a thought, okay? Just a thought, so that we're not interrupted. Okay. The book that I present to you today is called Stalin, Waiting for the Truth, Exposing the Falsehoods in Steven Kotkin's book, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941. The subtitle of my book is Falsehoods About Collectivization, the Famine, the Kirov Murder, Trotsky's Lies, the Moscow Trials, the Spanish Civil War, the military purges, Nikolai Yezhov's conspiracy, plus many other falsehoods. It is a detailed and carefully documented critique of Steven Kotkin's book, Stalin Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941, New York, Penguin, 2017. Kotkin's book is the second volume of what he, a professor of history at Princeton University and a fellow at the Hoover Institution, right over here, right, intends to be a 3-volume work and the definitive biography of Joseph Stalin. My book is written primarily for those who will never read Kotkin's book. It has to be, because very, very few people will in fact read this huge volume, huge in size and also in dishonesty. 909 pages of text, more than 158 pages of triple-columned footnotes in tiny type, with 5,295 footnotes, and 47 pages of bibliography, also in triple-columned in tiny type. The reader will not learn the history of the Soviet Union during the years 1929 to 1941 from Kotkin's book. Kotkin's book is completely unreliable. It is filled with false statements and unsupported assumptions. In short, with falsehoods, what in common language are called lies. It is dedicated to convincing the reader that Joseph Stalin was a monster, a mass murderer, an all-round evil person, and that the Soviet Union during his day was little short of a hell on earth. It is also devoted to trashing the idea of communism itself, partly through associating the communist movement with the monster Stalin, partly by smuggling in the notion that market capitalism is a far better form of political and social organization. Kotkin did not set out to write an accurate, objective account of Stalin's life during these years. Instead, he has cherry-picked evidence, and it's phony evidence to boot, to try to prove his very negative views about Stalin, the Soviet Union, and the communist movement. Of the very few readers who make it through the text of Kotkin's book, only a tiny fraction will read more than a small handful of the footnotes. Indeed, unless your eyes are very sharp, you will need a magnifying glass to read the footnotes. I did. And of those few who do read it, how many will actually check the references in the footnotes in order to see whether they do, in fact, provide evidence for the statements in the text that allege crimes by Stalin? If you think no one will, you are almost correct, for this is what I have done. My book contains the results of my careful checkup of every one of Kotkin's claims of criminal and or atrocious acts by Stalin and the Soviet leadership. I have written this book so that you don't have to read Kotkin's book. You can find out what Kotkin has to say about Stalin and the events of Soviet history from 1928 to 1941, and how he falsifies the history of this period. And you can do all of this in 350 pages. The chapters of my book are organized according to the major historical events of the Soviet 1930s as Kotkin deals with them. Collectivization and famine, the murder of Sergei Kirov, the death of Sergo Orjonikidze, Trotsky and the secret Trotskyist bloc, the first Moscow trial, the second Moscow trial, the Spanish Civil War, the third Moscow trial, the military purges, also known as the Tukhachevsky affair, Nikolai Yezhov's conspiracy, also called the Great Terror. There are 2 chapters on miscellaneous accusations and allegations against Stalin, and yet 2 more chapters that contain my detailed study and refutation of even more of Kotkin's allegations. You can select the topics that interest you most. When you read a chapter in my book, you will learn what Kotkin has to say about the events in question, how he falsifies them, and get a brief account of the truth, as demonstrated by the best evidence available today. You should read this book instead of reading Kotkin's book. If you haven't bought his book, don't bother. If you have bought it, then you can consult it if you should ever doubt my analysis of this or that incident. Then you can use it as a doorstop. My book is not a defense of Joseph Stalin. Somebody yelled out he's a Stalinist. Well, I'm not. My book is an attempt to discover the truth, no matter what it is. You should read my book if you want to know how Soviet history of the Stalin period is distorted, falsified, and mangled by mainstream historians. You can learn about the anti-Stalin paradigm, the false, dishonest model of Soviet history to which mainstream historians are expected to conform, and to which almost all of them do in fact conform. You can use this book as a kind of reference work. What does the best available evidence show about these events? How is the mainstream official history wrong about them? If you have suspected that this or that event of the Soviet 1930s may have been distorted by mainstream historians, you can read up on it here. If you have trusted the mainstream historical portrait of Stalin and of the Soviet 1930s, you are in for a big shock. I have written this book for those who will read Kotkin's book and for those who won't manage to get through it. But I have written it especially for those who never intend to even try to read Kotkin's monstrosity. If you have not yet decided to read Kotkin's book, take my advice. Don't waste your time. Read my book instead. You'll not only learn more, what you'll learn will be true. Read Kotkin, and what you learn will be all wrong, and you'll have to unlearn it by reading my book. The first volume of Kotkin's biography of Joseph Stalin is entitled Stalin, Volume-1, Paradoxes of Power, 1878 to 1928. It was published in 2014. As the title suggests, in it, Kotkin discusses Stalin's life up to the year 1928. The last chapter of that book is entitled Coda, If Stalin Had Died. Much of this chapter is about the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union. But this subject is not dealt with in Volume 1 at all. it is reserved for the opening chapters of Volume 2, the volume that I examine and critique in the book that I present to you today. If this coda at the end of Kotkin's Volume 1 was somehow supposed to argue that Stalin's life up to 1928 made the policy of agricultural collectivization inevitable or possible or something, it fails. In it, Kotkin does make the claim that agricultural modernization would have been both possible and less costly under a market capitalist system, but he does not even try to demonstrate how that might be done. And for the best of reasons, it has never been done anywhere. His depiction of collectivization as a brutal failure is not only unproven, it is unargued, simply assumed, and it is provably false. Now, I did not read this coda, this last chapter of Kotkin's Volume 1 of Stalin's biography, until I had read the volume itself, almost a year after its publication. In November 2014, the same year as the book's publication, Kotkin published an abbreviated version of this coda in the New York Review of Books. A friend sent me this essay as soon as he received his issue. Of course, a semi-popular magazine could contain no footnotes, no evidence for the assertions made in it, and I didn't expect to find any. But I was puzzled by the fact that the essay started with an event, collectivization, not dealt with in the book at all. Moreover, I knew that his depiction of collectivization runs counter to the best research on the subject. It did not augur well for the yet-to-come Volume 2. And so it has turned out. Volume 2 was published in October 2017. Having spent many years researching Soviet history of the 1930s, I immediately saw that this second volume repeats a number of falsehoods about major political events in conformity with the dominant and all too familiar model in mainstream Soviet historiography, the model that I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. I saw, too, that there are many specific incidents discussed in Volume 2 that I had not come across before. The first of these was a tale of minor importance, which you can read about in the book. It's called Klim, There Were No Mistakes. It's in Chapter 11. Here, Kotkin accuses Stalin of what? A peccadillo at most, something very minor. Perhaps this story then was true. So I researched it. It was difficult to obtain the materials. I suspect that Kotkin never bothered. At length, I was able to verify that, sure enough, it is a phony story with no evidence behind it. At this point, I thought, what if the whole book is like this? I was hooked. I realized that I had to know. I have done similar research projects before. Between 2005 and 2011, I researched and wrote a book detailing my discovery that Nikita Khrushchev's famous secret speech is made up of lies from beginning to end. That speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25, 1956, the speech in which Khrushchev depicted Stalin as a brutal dictator who had committed many murders and other crimes, had shocked the world and fatally undermined the international communist movement. Yet, as I discovered, it is a tissue of falsehoods. That's Khrushchev lied. Between 2010 and 2013, I checked all the references in Matthew Leno's massive, 820-plus pages book, The Kirov Murder in Soviet History, published by Yale University Press in 2010. I did so because, while studying it, I had noticed many errors of reasoning and many logical fallacies in this work, which comes to the conventional, acceptable conclusion that Sergei Kirov, first secretary of the Leningrad section of the Bolshevik Party, had been killed by a lone gunman in 1934. Lone gunman, right? We've heard that one before. I spent years in checking Leno's evidence and then in compiling much evidence about the murder that Leno and others had omitted. In the end, I reached the conclusion, inevitable given the evidence, that the Soviet courts had gotten it right in December 1934. Kirov had indeed been killed by a clandestine conspiratorial group of followers of Grigory Zinoviev. This important case led inexorably to the uncovering of the widespread anti-Soviet conspiracies uncovered in the later 1930s. And that's all I have in my book, the murder of Sergei Kirov. In 2011 to 2014, I checked every single allegation of wrongdoing of any kind by Stalin, the Soviet Union, and communists generally in Yale professor Timothy Snyder's award-winning book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Stalin and Hitler. After 30 months of research, I concluded that Snyder's book, too, contains not a single accurate allegation of crime of any kind by Stalin. Every one of such allegations is false, a fabrication either by Snyder himself or by the intensely anti-communist scholars, mainly Polish and Ukrainian, whose works Snyder relies on. And that's in my book, Blood Lies. Have a seat, sir. So I set out to do likewise with Kotkin's Volume-2, with one difference. This book is too long. Unlike Khrushchev's speech and Snyder's much shorter book, it would not be possible to check every fact claim in it, but not necessary either. In my book, I proceed as follows. I have selected 10 issues in the high politics of Soviet history during the 1930s and thoroughly researched Kotkin's account of each of them. I have added another 2 chapters of various allegations of lesser importance, where Kotkin alleges some kind of misdeed, criminal or moral, by Stalin. A chapter on strategies of misdirection in Kotkin's book is my attempt to analyze the different techniques of falsification which Kotkin employs, and also the errors of method and logic, perhaps intentional, perhaps due simply to carelessness or even to incompetence, which Kotkin utilizes in order to create the wildly distorted portrait of Stalin and Soviet policies that he promotes in his meretricious book. I have also added 2 chapters on central problems concerning Kotkin's research, his lack of source criticism, and his use of bias by omission. This book my book, deals with all the alleged crimes and atrocities that Kotkin charges Stalin with. It includes all the passages where Kotkin alleges any kind of reprehensible behavior or even insensitivity on Stalin's part. The little story, Klim, There Was No Mistakes, is an example of something that the reader will see a great many times in this book. Kotkin cannot be trusted to use his sources accurately or honestly. When Kotkin makes an assertion of fact or a fact claim about some crime or misdeed involving Stalin, the sources for this fact claim must be double-checked. Upon checking Kotkin's source, we normally find either 1, that his source does not support what Kotkin's text says or implies that it does, or 2, that the source does reflect what Kotkin says in his text, but that that source itself is dishonest, in that A, it does not reflect what its own evidence states, or B, its source is yet another secondary source, which, when it is examined in turn, does not support the fact claims given, or C, it cites no evidence at all. It is not only that many statements in Kotkin's books are factually false. These false statements do not occur randomly. There is a systematic quality to all of Kotkin's falsehoods. Every one is tendentiously anti-communist. I realized that I would have to carefully check, one by one, every fact claim about the Soviet leadership or Soviet actions that has a negative tendency, every allegation of a crime or an atrocity. My working hypothesis was as follows. I would find that many of Kotkin's anti-Stalin or anti-Soviet assertions, or, as I call them, fact claims, are false, not supported by the evidence Kotkin cites, or indeed by any evidence. My further hypothesis was that the secondary sources Kotkin cites in support of these statements would either not support Kotkin's fact claims, or would themselves be fallacious, unsupported by the evidence, if any, that they cite. My research has fully corroborated both of these hypotheses. In fact, I discovered that my initial hypothesis was too cautious. I have found not that many, but that all of Kotkin's fact claims of an anti-Stalin tendency are false. In my book, I present the results of that research. Therefore, ironically, Kotkin's book proves the opposite of what its author intended. It proves that Stalin committed no crimes during the 1930s. For if there were any evidence that Stalin did commit crimes during this period, surely Kotkin would have found that evidence and included it in this book. Kotkin's references are very extensive. He has clearly done a lot of reading. Now, strictly speaking, a negative cannot be proven. I have pointed out places in his text where Kotkin is guilty of this very error, claiming that you can prove a negative. But Kotkin has been researching the Stalin era in the Soviet Union all his professional life, ever since he started his graduate work, ever since he did his PhD dissertation. The fact that during this long period of time he has found no evidence of any crime by Stalin, and that every allegation of such in this book turns out, on careful inspection, to be fraudulent, is the best indication we have at present that Stalin committed no crime that can be documented by evidence. This conclusion will strike many readers as shocking, even outrageous. So don't feel bad if you're shocked and outraged, okay? You're not alone. But the truth is not established by consensus, much less by the consensus of anti-communists. Anyone who bases her judgment not on the consensus of experts, but on the evidence, will be forced to draw this conclusion. That is what I have done in the present book. Doing so reveals the bankruptcy, not only of Kotkin's efforts, but of the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period generally. A word or two about Katyn, the Katyn massacre, as an example of the anti-Stalin paradigm. Might be interested in this. Last July 2018, I spoke to you here at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library about my book on the Katyn massacre, and we have some copies here. I have been studying the Katyn question since the late 1990s. In 2013, I published an article on Katyn, and then in 2015, a short book published in French in France. My book-length, full-scale study of Katyn was published in early July 2018, just before I spoke to you. Some things have happened since July that illustrate how committed the anti-communists are to the story, false as it turns out, that the Soviets were guilty of shooting the thousands of Polish POWs, and how afraid they are of the truth. 1. I was attacked by Dr. Yaroslav Sharuk, president of the Institution of National Remembrance. This is a right-wing, nationalist, racist, and of course anti-communist institute of the Polish government. He wrote the president and board of trustees of my university to protest my conclusion that the Nazis, not the Soviets, were guilty. So it's very important, right, that the Soviets be guilty, not the Nazis. 2, in August 2018, a month after my talk here, I was invited to record an interview about my book for a podcast series on new books in Soviet and Russian history. This is called the New Books Network. In early September, I was interviewed over the internet by a young American professor of Soviet history. She told me that she would email me when the podcast was published online as a part of this series. 2 days later, she emailed me to tell me that Marshall Poe, head of the New Books Network and professor of history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, had refused to publish my podcast. Gotta wait for Norma here. His only explanation, this is all he had to say about that, was that this is, quote, interviewing someone who thinks Sandusky is innocent. Jerry Sandusky is the pedophile athletic coach at Penn State University who's serving a long prison term, right? A junior professor, my interviewer was embarrassed and saddened, but could do nothing. Since 2012, I have been a member of the H. Poland email list. It publishes a monthly list of new books in Polish studies. At the beginning of October 2018, I sent in a brief description of my Katyn book for the November list. Instead, the moderator of that list expelled me from the list without explanation. My 3 appeals to the HNet editors, HNet is sponsored by Michigan State University, have been fruitless. They have told me that list moderators can basically do what they want, as long as they do not discriminate on political grounds. And they found that this was not political. What do these 3 attacks on my Katyn research show? That the anti-Stalin paradigm is enforced and policed very strictly. Kotkin's huge book is clearly intended to help define and refine the boundaries of what is acceptable to write about Stalin and the Soviet 1930s for a long time to come. It also confirms what I have learned from my previous research, beginning with Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform in 2005, and especially since my book Khrushchev Lied in 2011. Capitalist and Trotskyist historiography on the Stalin period is bankrupt. Completely. It is based upon the anti-Stalin paradigm, which is taken as sacrosanct, never to be questioned. As a result, no bourgeois or Trotskyist research on the Stalin period can be trusted. Now, many people will find this incredible. As I predicted in the introduction to my book Khrushchev Lied back in 2011, it'll be far easier and far safer to believe that there is something wrong with me, Grover Furr, than to look honestly at the evidence I cite and question the whole course of historiography on the Stalin-era Soviet Union for the past 63 years. That's why they call me a Stalinist, right? You label somebody a Stalinist, then you can just disregard him, right? Well, he's just, hopelessly biased, blind, whatever. We don't have to bother with him. So I can say at the beginning of my talks, as I always do, I'm out to discover the truth. I'm not out to defend Stalin. But that doesn't cut the ice with the anti-communists. It's too facile a label. Okay. That's what's happened. It is an example of killing the messenger. I bring the bourgeois and Trotskyist historians the bad news. And instead of honestly facing the evidence, they attack me, the bearer of the news that they don't want to hear. And they hope that if they just ignore it, then it'll go away. But I'm not going anywhere. And even if I do, reality, the truth that I have discovered, will remain as a reproach to the anti-communist liars. In a letter to the editor published in the New York Times on November 3rd, 2017, Stephen D. Engel, professor of history at Florida International University, wrote the following words, quote, I have taught American history for 27 years at a university, and I open every class with a standard lecture that focuses on the 3 kinds of history, what actually happened, what we are told happened, and what we come to believe happened. This is important because we live in a world in which what people believe happened is all that matters. And trying to get to the facts, sadly, appears less relevant. Now, if he wrote that about American history, imagine how much even more important it is about Soviet history of the Stalin period, right? End quote. Scholarship is the attempt to ascertain the truth. Arguments that proceed not from an objective search for truth, but from some other motive, such as an attempt to attack or defend some specific allegation or historical paradigm, may fairly be labeled propaganda. When accompanied by the trappings of scholarship, references, bibliography, fraudulent assurances of objectivity, such writings, in reality, constitute not scholarship, but, here I use quotation marks, scare quotes, propaganda with footnotes. It is the conclusion of my study that Kotkin's book is precisely such a work. As an example, another example, not taken from my book, of the fact that the anti-Stalin paradigm has feet of clay, I will quote the late Arkady Roginsky. Roginsky was the founder of the Memorial Society, a viciously anti-communist group that calls itself a human rights organization in Russia. It gets funding from Western NGOs. It also has a contradictory relationship with the Russian government, which has given it access to a lot of materials and has also tried to restrict it in certain ways. Over the years, I've read a lot of Roginski's research, and of course he's an anti-communist, anti-Stalinist, and so forth. Surprisingly, it is usually very well done. I can't say always because I haven't studied all of it. This is the reason I include this anecdote. I quote Roginsky, quote, "In the early 90s, I did a lot of statistics on Soviet terror. I studied a huge number of reporting sheets about terror for all years from different regions of the Soviet Union. The statistics we have, seriously, begins from 1921. Until 1921, only fragments remain. And since 1921, huge folders. In 1994, I studied everything, transcribed everything, and put it away. Later it should be published. I looked at the numbers I had obtained." This is Roginsky, okay? It's anti-communist. Now he says, "There are people around me in the outside world whose opinion is important for me. There is the traditional intellectual public opinion, and most importantly, the opinion of former prisoners who were still very much alive in 1994. And they measure our victims in the whole history of terror by some absolutely inconceivable figures, tens of millions. And yet, according to my calculations," this is him, "in the entire history of Soviet power from 1918 to 1987, according to the surviving documents, it turns out that 7,100,000 people were arrested by security agencies across the country. At the same time, among them were persons arrested, and quite a lot, not for political crimes. Yes, they were arrested by security agencies, but security agencies arrested people for banditry, smuggling, counterfeiting, and for many other general purpose crimes. Under all these numbers, there are folders with documents. In the annual reports of the security services, there are those involved, so many, including with arrest, including without arrest. Then the table begins the movement of the arrested, passed on the completed investigation cases, so many including transferred to a special session of the NKVD, so many transferred to the courts and tribunals, so many. In non-judicial bodies, so many. Those who had run away, those who had died, everything. By the way, there were very few who ran away. And here is the final figure, 7 million. This is for the whole history of Soviet power. What to do about it? See, this is a problem for him. What to do about it? Quote, I'm still quoting. "Public opinion says that we have almost 12 million arrested in 1937 to 1939 alone. And I belong to this society," says Roginsky. "I live among these people. I am a part of them. Not the Soviet government part, not the Russian democracy, but these people. I just knew for sure that, first, they would not believe me." They wouldn't believe Roginsky, right? Card-carrying, medal-winning anti-communist. "And second, for the circle to which I consider myself to belong, it would mean that everything we were told about these figures up until now, by quite respected by us people, is not true. So I put all my calculations aside for a long time. After years, it may be possible to publish them, but not now, later." That's Arkady Roginsky, the founder of the Memorial Society. Here, now it's me again. Here I must point out that Roginsky was not being entirely honest either. He says that 7,100,000 people were arrested by the security agencies between 1918 and 1987. But that is not accurate. What he should have said is that were 7,100,000 arrests. It is obvious that some of these people were arrested more than once, and in more than one city, and or under more than one identity, so that the number of different people was less, perhaps much less, than 7,100,000. Moreover, many of these people were not convicted of any crime and were released. This is clear from the lists of so-called victims of political terror in the Soviet Union, published by the Memorial Society itself, and I give you a URL. If you read Russian, you can go and take a look. So even this arch-anti-communist, honored by all the other arch-anti-communists, knew that he had to keep the truth quiet. This fact, in turn, exposes the bankruptcy, dishonesty, and shallowness of anti-communist and anti-Stalin research. It is not a matter of Kotkin's unreliability only. There is no evidence that Stalin committed any crime in the 1930s. Yet the flood of anti-Stalin and anti-communist falsehoods continues unabated. Lies are necessary in order to make Stalin, the Soviet Union in his day, and the communist movement look bad. This level of dishonesty in the mainstream historiography of the Soviet Union means that little of the mainstream academic research on Soviet history of the 1930s is helpful for those of us who are trying to understand what really happened, what actually happened in the Soviet Union during this period. But the 1930s are crucial in understanding not only the successes, but also the later failure of the Soviet Union. The Stalin period led not only to the successful industrialization, to the costly victory against fascist invasion, to the post-war increase in living standards for the Soviet population, to the worldwide struggles for workers' rights and the anti-imperialist struggles for liberation from Western and Japanese colonialism. The Stalin period also led, upon Stalin's death, to the coup d'etat on March 5th, 1953, when he died, to the second coup against Lavrentiy Beria of June 26, 1953, to Khrushchev's accession to the leadership and thereby to the beginning of official wholesale falsification of Soviet history in the service of reforms that abandoned piece by piece the goal of transitioning to communism. These developments led eventually to the renewed falsification of Soviet history under Gorbachev, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the open restoration of predatory capitalism. The historian's purpose and aim should be to study historical events with a view to understanding historical change. Understanding the history of the Soviet Union is essential for any accurate understanding of world history. The last book by the late Moshe Lewin, a famous, albeit conventionally anti-Stalin and anti-communist historian of the Soviet Union, is entitled The Soviet Century. By century, Lewin meant the 74 years between the 1917 revolution and the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. But in reality, the term the Soviet century could be applied to world history during this same period. The Russian Revolution, the fight for socialism, the international communist movement were determining forces in world history. This is not the place to list the major historical developments of the 20th century, but every one of them was shaped in a significant way by the international communist movement and the Soviet Union. One brief example must suffice here and now. An accurate understanding of World War II must include the fact that, by stopping in May to June 1937, the Tukhachevsky and Trotsky-led military conspiracies that threatened to put the massive human and natural resources of the Soviet Union on the side of the fascist powers, Stalin and the Soviet government saved the people of the world, including the people of the West, from a far greater catastrophe than the one that did occur. No account of world history that omits this fact has any claim to accuracy. Yet because of anti-Stalinism and anti-communism, this fact is not just unacknowledged, it is staunchly denied, as Kotkin does. Anti-Stalinists and anti-communists, including much or most of the left, falsify Soviet history and deny the truth, even when it is slowly, painstakingly uncovered. This denial and falsification stretches from the left, Trotskyists and anarchists, to the mainstream and the far-right fascists. Do they believe their own falsifications? For the most part, they do. But why? Because of the dishonesty of mainstream historiography of the Stalin period. If the mainstream acknowledged and publicized the truth, instead of the flood of falsehoods like those we find in books like Kotkin's, it would be far harder for people to ignore or be uninformed about the truth. We cannot understand any aspect of the history of the past century without an accurate understanding of Soviet history of the Stalin period. My book aims to contribute, however modestly, to the aim of uncovering the truth about this era. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I have a volunteer to pass out these flyers here? I've got some flyers.
Also, please, everyone reach in your wallets, purses, or whatever. And if you have any money, please put it in the.
Any money at all?
Yes.
All of it.
And if you have no money, don't take any out. We'll pass this out. As we know, we don't receive any money from major foundations or other groups. Well, institutions, we wouldn't accept it if they gave it to us, and they're not likely to do that. So we do rely on you, and we thank you for your generosity.
I would like to kick things off by making a $100 donation to the institution, to the institute and the library.
All right.
There it is. Thank you. It's very important work that you do.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, I won't make any jokes on this, but please do. We're in good shape. For some reason, bourgeois accountants say if you're in good shape economically, they use the color of international anarchism, black. We're in the black. So that's a good place to be, yes. Next week, we have another of our very good friends and members. Al Sargis will talk on the DPRK, the politics and military strategy of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea.
North Korea.
Or North Korea, aka.
Everybody's got a copy of this here? This is the flyer on the book.
That will be good. And then following that, we have our comrade Craig Collins will speak on democratic socialism, a impossible dream. And if you want to know what he means by that, you'll have to come not next Sunday, but the following Sunday. So, Raj, it's
Q&A time, right?
Q&A.
yes. And
All right.
could I grab one of these now and pay
Yes.
for you later?
Sure.
I got 20 right here.